Anjan, looking at the concept of self has been one of my interests, both from a neuroscience point of view and a human point of view. We've followed it very much on Closer to Truth in various ways. And recently, we've been exploring art as a vehicle to understand things. So I begin to talk to some people and ask them, can art affect the self? And some people's reaction immediately is, what's the self? There is no self. It's also a combination of lots of specific things, and when you put them all together, you don't have anything new. When you look at this question of the relationship between art and self from a cognitive neuroscientist point of view, what can you say? What kind of experiments have you done that might relate to this?
One thing we are interested is the way in which we impose value in the world, which includes values of other people, ourselves, and so on. The brain turns out to be very good at discriminating objects. Faces are a great example that often you can see someone once or twice and then you remember them. Mm-hmm. Our brains are not very good, are sloppy at ascribing values. And so we tend to conflate moral values with aesthetic values and vice versa. Mm-hmm. The ancient Greeks talked about the good, the beautiful, and truth as core values, right? We think that those things get conflated very easily. So what are the implications of that for either art or aesthetics? In art, we're finding that when people know something about the artist and they're looking at the art, their experience of the art changes if they think the person is a decent person or if they think the person is just contemptible. And the experience of it changes. Similarly, in a more direct way, we have found that when people are looking at faces, that depending on how attractive a person is, they are ascribed with all sorts of values as being more intelligent, more trustworthy, more hardworking, and so on. And the converse is also true, which is that if someone has a facial anomaly, like a scar, a developmental defect, implicitly people think that person is less intelligent, less trustworthy, less hardworking, and so on. And we know something about the neuroscience of that, but culture plays a huge role, at least popular culture as a form of art. If you think about movies, Bond villains, the Star Wars universe, the Marvel universe, it's incredible how often the villains have some kind of facial anomaly. You don't have to develop a backstory. Disfigured face, disfigured person, right? That's the message.
Wow. And can you see neuroscience correlates of that?
Yeah. So we have found that in the brain, in our visual cortex, there are areas that specifically are tuned to faces. It's called the fusiform face area. And another important structure that integrates different kinds of emotions called the amygdala, that when people have more of a bias against faces that have these anomalies, the degree of bias modulates the activity in these areas. So the areas that are tuned to faces and this area that integrates these kinds of emotions. And then it's further modulated by other factors. For example, some people think the world is basically just. It's called a just world's belief, right? Everything happens for a reason. Other people think it's all random. Bad things happen to good people, good things happen to bad people, and everybody falls on that spectrum. What we find is in this part of the brain, in the amygdala, the more you believe that the world is just, the greater the neural activity in that part of the brain in response to anomalous faces. So you start to see how culture and what people are bringing to bear when they're looking at these faces modulates their neural activity into a behavioral pattern in which they show a negative bias to this kind of, and they're making an inference about the self of the other person.
Yeah, and this is this is a theory of mind where you project into the other mind, but using this biological perception. Now, is that rooted in evolution? That faces that were anomalous had some sort of a danger for people? Could that? I mean,
It's a great question, and one we have been pondering, because the argument there is it's a sensitivity, a pathogen sensitivity that and you want to avoid that. So that has been a big notion. We just finished a study where we went to Tanzania. I didn't, but people who work with me went to Tanzania, and there is a hunter-gatherer tribe there called the Hadza. There are about 1,000 or so Hadza tribes people still around, and they move around in small camps. We went and studied them and basically found that they were not subject to the same kind of biases that everybody we've tested in America and to some extent in Europe. They were not subject to this bias. But we also had my collaborators have some questionnaires that assesses how much contact have they had with cultures outside the Hadza. So they might be asked questions like, do you know any words in Swahili? Does Nelson Mandela mean anything to you, right? So those kinds of questions. And what we find is that the more exposure they've had to non-Hadza culture, these biases start to emerge. Like you can see the lines just sort of emerging out of that. So it's one piece of information, but it at least suggests that culture has a huge impact on these kinds of biases that we all have. And so the optimistic story is if that's true, we can also unlearn them.
And these biases form more of our self than maybe we would like to admit.
They form more of ourself, of who we are and how we interpret the world, how we are interpreting other people we encounter in everyday life.